Hello and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us on the beautiful beaches of Kozhikode for this conversation about languages. Um, Father Tongue Motherland by Peggy Mohan is a historical and linguistic text that kind of shows us how South Asian languages emerged through long processes of migration, intermarriage, and everyday transmission. So basically, Peggy argues that vocabulary arrives through the male migrants, whereas grammatical structures are imparted to us through the women. So that's where you get the father tongue and the motherland. So
Yeah.
let's start with you explaining your central thesis to the audience.
Okay. Is this clear enough? Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, we need to go back even further than the Indus Valley because South Asia, especially the Indus Valley area, was the site of where the first people who left Africa eventually settled. They came via the southern route, which is from Somalia, Yemen, came across and settled there. This was essentially the only reasonably large concentration of women that came because they were not migrants, they were just spreading out. So we have to know where women came from. So women are perhaps the oldest inhabitants. After that, most of the migrants who came, this is really strange echoing. Most of the migrants who came and left a mark tended to be men, and they were different at different times in history. They came without women, and it's not only in India. In large parts of the world, we had this thing of male migrants coming who would have gone extinct were it not for tie-ups with local women, and who were not merely women, they were also part of a larger ecosystem of families and so. So what you got was a new generation of children who, as in all these kinds of families, first learn their mother's language or the local language, and up until about the age of 5, which is what school-going age now, then they would have started getting acculturated into the languages of their fathers. But that's the first step of the process. That doesn't do much. The most it does is creates little things like what we call Prakrits, which to me are not very different from what the migrants brought in. Like Prakrit and Sanskrit are crazily similar, and if you weren't listening to accents, you would probably be thinking that they are such close cousins. It's just that people needed to tell them apart, things weren't written. But that's just the first step. So in these families, you have these children whose first notions of language come from their mothers, which is why going back all the way to the migrants out of Africa, we have these iconic Indian sounds, ter, der, ner, la. Those are old. They are like, they go back 70,000 years.
Like in Kozhikode.
Kozhikode. No. Kozhikode is a younger sound because I don't know when it came. That ra it's still up for grabs. Somebody do the research. I would love to do it. But I think it is younger than ter, der, ner, la. That's just a guess because I know the tribal Dravidian languages do it differently. So if they haven't got it, then how come only Tamil and Malayalam? It's something strange going on there. So basically, we have a first step of the process is the children who have their mother's language or the local language, and onto it they get acculturated into their father's words because their fathers are powerful, useful to have their words. And then comes the next step, which is the important one for the hybridization, when local people who are not related to the migrants suddenly say, there's something in it for us. We would like to live in the cities they've built. We would like to take up whatever occupations they are allowing us. And in the process, they come with completely their own operating system. We use the word grammar, but I think in modern days we can say operating system. And in that, they graft on the migrants' words. And you get things like languages in India which outwardly look like the settlers' words, but the grammatical system that holds them together, the cement, is older. So then you get the hybridizing of the languages, which is why if you've ever studied Sanskrit and you're a North Indian and you're told it's a lot like Hindi, it's not. Because Sanskrit doesn't say have gender with its verbs, but Dravidian languages do. So something else is going on.
So this is interesting also because, there's the great man theory of history, where history is told largely through the eyes of great men. But you take this field of history and linguistics into the domestic space, where we learn from women, we're in kitchens and not courtrooms,
Yeah.
And I find that really fascinating. Were you aware or were you thinking through a feminist viewpoint when you were doing this?
I don't know if it was feminist, maybe it could be called that, but I'm an Indian from the Caribbean. And the Caribbean is where we have most recently, in the last 500 years, seen languages mix and merge. So at the time I first went to university, people were talking not about historical linguistics and this is descended from Latin, this is descended from Sanskrit. We always talked about two descent lines, a mother line and a father line. I can put it that way, but I wasn't thinking even specifically of being feminist, that you have the older people who were there and the people who get affected by the migrants coming in, and that creates two streams. And a very simple way to put it would be to look at a creature like me. My father was a normal Indian young man who went to college in Canada at a time when there were no Indian girls going. So he fell in love, that was the age, and with my mother. So what you get is a hybrid who outwardly may have a lot of the surface features of one of the streams, but all actually genetically contains both. But you can't see it. Just like I can listen to Malayalam and hear a lot of the Sanskrit words, but what I can't hear is the deeper things that bind us as a nation, which is the grammatical structures, because the grammatical structures are internal. So in a way, you can see it, that what's from my father is internal. You can't see it, it's the genetic code and so, but you can see the outward traits that make me look like my mother. Just like you can see the words in Malayalam, which make it look like very clean Sanskrit.
Okay, so let's kind of bring this alive with a case study. Let's talk about Dakhini, which is Indo-Aryan in vocabulary, but Dravidian in its grammatical structure. Can you tell us about how that language comes to be and how it travels?
Okay. I'm hearing somebody else's voice. It's very confusing to me. Is somebody else talking? Is there someone? Oh, it's from there. Okay. You know, what is important to me about Dakhini is just like with Creoles, you need something in real historic time which has documentation. Who came? What did they do? What cities did they build? What people did they interact with? That way you can build a model. So Dakhini has been fantastic because it's exactly on the cusp between South India and North India. What are the features and how did it mix? How did this thing come into life? And what you find is something of a Telugu type grammar. Some people say Kannada is in there, quite possibly. I think it's only two genders, Kannada has three. But there is that feeling of a Dravidian grammatical structure overlaid with words that came from the migrant men. Again, the same two-step process, because the men came from the north and from other places, and then they married locals, and you got children who spoke something like their fathers, but not quite. There were certain things missing, like anyone who knows North Indian languages know we have this ne thing in the past where the verb agrees with the object and not with the subject. And there's somewhere exactly between North and South where this vanishes, but gender doesn't vanish. So it's a very interesting thing to see which things got kept. If you listen to Dakhini, all their subordinate clauses, relative clauses, are done on a Dravidian model. Their notion of gender is, except for the fact that they have it with adjectives, it's a Dravidian gender. Gender in Dravidian languages is I eat, you eat, no gender. But he, she, and it eats, there the gender comes in. That's in Dakhini. And that's something very, very old. In fact, if it's there in Dravidian languages, we have evidence that it probably goes back to the time of the Indus Valley, which is one of the things that makes me quite convinced that you have a Proto-Dravidian presence in the Indus Valley. Proto, I say, because what has survived in the south has mutated since those days. Some things have been lost, but many things have been kept.
This kind of brings us to the question of how languages travel. And Dakhini is again a very good example of like North and South, Aryan and Dravidian, elite and everyday. It kind of brings everything. But then I also wonder, why do some languages get marginalized and some languages become more majoritarian?
It's all about power. When we talk about the migrants that came into India and we think of the first people from out of Africa, we talk of the Zagros farmers who created the Dravidian people, we talk of the steppe migrants who created the Vedic culture, the East, the migrants from Vietnam and Burma that came in to the East. Then we have later on the Central Asian sultanates. They have one thing in common we must not forget, unpleasant as it is to say, they had military power. They were not, and also they didn't take the country over right away. It took ages, it took 2 steps. Like they first intermarried, but the expansion to take over territory was usually a secondary thing. Like the Vedic people probably got here 3,700 years ago, but it's 3,000 years ago, with a gap of 700 years before they consolidated and started moving across the north of India. So power, it's about power. However much we say these are nice people and we love their languages, it doesn't happen. Because Kerala is a prime example. Many people are migrating into Kerala and they will have no effect on the language because they haven't come with power. They've come individually. That's a very big difference.
Is changeability also something that gives us durability? Because you talk about language as shape-shifting and mutating. So is changeability or flexibility, are these things central to durability?
See, one of the things that excites me about Hindi, before the British got their little hands into it and started making it too stable, is that it was moving around the country with different names. Like Dakhini took a lot of words from whoever were the Sultanate and blended it onto a Dravidian grammar. The Andaman Islands, we like to think that they speak tribal languages. They are interesting languages, but they're almost dead. What these people speak is a form of Hindi, which seems to me to have a Telugu-type grammar, along with a Bengali-type grammar. And if I were to give you sentences in it, it would make more sense to you than it would to someone in the north, but we would all understand it. So Hindi was a vehicle because it was linked to the Sultanates, really, and the Mughals, and it was moving around in a way. It was there before they came. A lot of languages came up in the 12th century. What is interesting is that the whole north got a shot of new languages in the 12th century, but Kerala independently also was undergoing a major change. It didn't seem to be related. Mani Pravalam, through the literary mode, was coming in, and Malayalam was picking up a lot of pure Sanskrit words. But it's probably a similar ethos in the society, an excitement. 12th century was a magical time where lots of things were happening which in a way connected us while giving us our spaces. So that's something very precious here. Our languages are separate enough to give us spaces, but connected enough that we don't really feel lost.
Okay, so tell us about language X.
Oh, language X. Okay, that's a nice term. X, for anybody who studied algebra, you know it's an unknown. So when we didn't know where certain words in Sanskrit came from, because we have an idea of what is from the Rig Veda, what should be in Sanskrit, but here's some words that they don't look Dravidian, maybe, not recognizably, but maybe they are, or maybe they're Phoenician, we don't know. But there's a large category of words in the Rig Veda which did not appear to come from Sanskrit. So what did it come from? So X, language X came, that was the term. So that while it became, it started as unknown, it became a sort of a code word for the language of the Indus Valley. Now, I don't know why we say language, because if the whole of South India has so many languages, do you think the Indus Valley had only one language? That's not possible. Their transport was so primitive in those days. They didn't have horses, no fast transport. They probably had families of languages. And it appears to me that a lot of their languages were related. They must have also had earlier languages that they eclipsed, cannibalized, or whatever. But these languages all have what I would think of as a Dravidian flavor to them, with a few differences, tiny differences. So basically, how I did this, I didn't do any of, sorry, I didn't do, I'm getting confused. I didn't do the usual looking at Indus Valley seals. I'm not convinced that those were meant to be grammar sentences with verbs and nouns or narrative. I rather look at the modern languages because, see, nothing's been written. India's been pretty bad at writing things down, partly because they didn't want people like you and me to read the Vedas and know more than the Brahmins. That would have been a disaster. So they kept them close to their chests. So we have to intuit backwards. What are the things in the entire set of languages of India, but definitely of the Northwest, into the whole Pakistan region, up into the mountains, the ones that were spared all the assimilation? What are the things that are not like Sanskrit and not like the Prakrits? And you get things like the gender in the verbs, which we know to be a Dravidian thing. Then you get, like, if you understand Hindi, you'll hear hua, ye ho gaya, a perfective, non-perfective thing, which Chinese will understand very well, but it's not Sanskritic. The tar, dar, nar, la are totally not from Sanskrit. They took their time coming into Sanskrit. Can we tell these people to slightly tone it down? I am neurodiverse. Excuse me, can you just tone it down? You're really confusing me. This has been a problem all my life. And maybe I can write because I'm not able to handle this. So doing a process of minusing out the things that could not have come from Sanskrit, triangulating, because you have a huge area, all of Pakistan, India up to Allahabad, down to Maharashtra. And these are the places where you see features that probably give us an inkling of what the old languages looked like. One of the things that a very enigmatic thing I noticed is, and it's even in our Indian English, we are a people who like nouns. We don't like verbs. So if we can say something using a noun, like you can say the advent of Diwali, you don't say Diwali is coming. You would rather put it into a noun. And that is something which is very large in this country, and it goes, I think, all the way into Iran, and they may have changed subsequently. But so these are the kind of things. Sanskrit's a very verby language. The notion of how verbs behave, cases, karaks, they're not in our languages. We have a very Dravidian thing where instead of saying grahe, or in the house, we will use a word that sounds like graha, ghar, but we will say ghar mein, which could be vehicle, and il does not change. It doesn't change for each and every kind. So basically, we're finding things in the. Oh, from there, okay. We're finding things in the languages which could not have come from Sanskrit, which tell us something was there before, and what was it? And as for what the words were, you can tell if in South India all the languages have so many different nouns are the first thing to go. But if you look at all the South Indian languages, the pronouns and the numerals are quite similar. So could that be a clue to what is very old? It'd be very interesting to work back and to get students to try to create, like if you look at Punjabi, you will never think that, it sounds to me like Malayalam. It has a lot of the double things, kabbo, sajjo, that is not Vedic. It has Narl, Jana. That's a Malayalam Sandhi rule. It's not Sanskrit. So, and this is Punjab. And you can go further north. You go into Garhwal. I mean, these are old sounds that are not even in Sanskrit. So you can go this kind of route and triangulate back and try to guess at an earlier history. That's exciting to me because too many people get excited by similarities. I like to look at the differences because they tell you about what was there before. And it tells you about that maternal stream that gets submerged and can only show in little touches like this.
Why did we lose it, do you think? You said there's something there before. Why have we lost it?
You lose it because that is how the process works. You see it even nowadays in tribal languages in India, that there is a tendency, and even in our own lives, that new vocabulary comes in, and most of it is nouns. If you look closely at Malayalam, you will have a hard time finding a Sanskrit word that is not a noun. They're almost all. So that is the first thing that come in. They have a few verbs, not many. But in fact, Malayalam is the lightest touch because we can say that they are nouns. Whereas in Punjabi, Hindi, etc., everything came. Everything got replaced by a new coat of paint, whereas Malayalam just got its fingernails painted. So you have that sense of how language, there seems to be a process that the easiest thing to bring in are nouns. Like if you're going to talk about origami, why make a new word for origami? You will take the Japanese word. But it doesn't mean that we are Japanese. It means that it's a useful word. But if we have more contact with them, we may take their verbs, we may take their adjectives, we may take their the endings on words like ill. And in fact, that's a very crazy thing. Japanese behaves very much like Malayalam in its structure. There's no reason on earth, but it just happens to.
So we've talked quite a bit about migrants coming in and bringing in their vocabulary with them. But can you also tell us a little bit about the places where these languages are formed? Because particularly with the Magadhan language, you talk about the forest lore that brings...
Yeah, this is something I'm going to be talking about in another few days. I'm going to be meeting the geneticists who actually did the work. We know that there's something about the eastern part of India, Bengal, Bihar, I mean, my family being from that area, Orissa, Assam, which has a different flavor. It's got rid of gender. It has a very Asiatic thing that we put markers on to numbers. Ekjon, Ekta. This is something in every Asian language except Tibetan. And where did it come from? And somebody doing research on rice found 4,000 years ago there was a migration. Again, 100% men. They cannot find any female genetic markers. Men coming in from the east. And the words, we already detected Vietnamese words in our tribal languages and some Burmese words. And what was this? And we don't have any historical memory of these people coming, but the geneticists have been very helpful in telling us that these people came. Like, you can go into the forest areas of Jharkhand and you will be able to test the people as having 65% East Asian heritage, 100% Indian heritage from the mother's side. So the maternal side is 100% Indian, empty DNA, and the male DNA, we know there was a migration, and that migration came with power. It fizzled out. We don't have a continuing relationship with Vietnam. But so these geneticists are very good at helping us. They're good at helping us, like looking at what is it. In fact, the migration from the Indus Valley into the south of India is so recent that we cannot see a difference in the Dravidian heritage in the south and the north. So, in fact, up into the highest reaches in the Karakorams in Pakistan, you're finding people have uniform amount of Dravidian and something else heritage. And it's absolutely crazy because as a linguist, I'm not surprised. I see it in the languages, even the most remote languages. If, say, in Hunza, the people who came in speaking Burushaski were men, who did they marry? Obviously, Dravidian women. That's why you will find their gender pattern is the same as in South India. It's just the notion of how you string grammatical elements together. Something has come across from the woman. So I, in fact, tried to speculate on what was the journey south like. Why did they come? What must have been happening? Who did they meet? Who came first? There is nothing in the historical record, but my guess is, as always, it would first have been men, women much later, and the men would have come and met a different kind of indigenous Indian here who didn't say things like man, nay, there was no ergativity. And that in particular was the thing that went. And by the time women started coming, there was a kind of a frontier Dravidian language, which is the precursor of what is spoken here. There's so much in the South Indian history we don't know. Why is there no pre-Dravidian tribal language in the South? There isn't. Every single language is Dravidian. Now, what does that mean? We're just making an assumption. Does it mean that they were already like that? But you can't find early first Indians in South India. Everyone's been assimilated. And that's also exciting because it's a puzzle to solve. Maybe in Sri Lanka we would find a few.
So, can any of us ever really say we have a mother tongue?
Huh?
But can any of us ever really say that we have a mother tongue?
It depends upon where you live. I think that the more homogenized society becomes, like English-speaking societies in the West, you can say you have one mother tongue, and you think of it as normal because you're the one writing the linguistic theory. But here, there's something odd happening. You have people having more than one, but the interesting thing is it makes sense. We don't do the same thing with our two languages. So like, if you are doing particle physics or writing AI algorithms, you're not doing it in Malayalam, even though you could. But we don't do it because we've actually divided the labor between the languages. So while we speak a number of languages, we're not good translators because we don't do the same things in two languages. That I think is going to change because there has to be quite a lot of translation in India because there's no way we can allow me to guess what you mean in Malayalam because I can make out 90% of the words. What about the 10%? We have to have proper solid translation to connect the country. And AI can do it because this is just not even difficult to do. And to do it without English, because English adds in a variable. English is different from our languages, but all our languages, you line them up, they're just crazily fit a template with little differences here and there. So I feel very hopeful that the next thing that could start happening here is that the 80% of Indians who don't speak English will be assimilated into all that we're talking about, because they'll just be able to access everything we write and say in languages that are useful for them. Until that happens, we do have no chance against China. When I was told this is the largest lit fest in Asia, I wondered, because China has 900 million internet users who are improving their internet. Do we have 900 million? We could, and we probably will in some time, but we don't yet. And we will not until we have all our languages connected through translation, not through assimilation. Maybe we will find ourselves doing something in a different way. I'm very excited. I feel another 12th century moment. The moment that Mani Pravalam came into existence in Kerala must have had a similar vibe to what I'm feeling in 2025, 2026.
This translation question is interesting because we talk so much about things being lost in translation, but there's also something that's clearly found in translation.
Okay, I have a theory about translation. For anybody who's ever bought a nice sari, you will know the term handloom, and there's powerloom. Powerloom is for the stuff that government documents, even textbooks, the kind of things that don't have crazy imagination. But the sari that the weaver has taken a year of his life and woven, that is something precious. You don't try to translate that. Or somebody with great love will take a year of his life and translate it. But we should have a powerloom sector where very urgently needed documents for tech, mainly for tech, and government things, administrative things, will be translated automatically, where you just simply have to press a button saying, I want it in Assamese, and it'll come to you in the script, everything. You'll type in Hindi, and all the Urdu dots will come as they should. It's not difficult. It's actually something very easy. And I'm just surprised that we haven't done it. But I think that's the next thing, because if India has to move into the realm of AI is next level language. And we have to know that if we're dealing with next level language, we are a multilingual society, and we have to be able to use all of the things will happen. We will start editing how we write. I will know, for example, that my relative clauses will go into Malayalam a little oddly, but you won't have a problem with it, because I have listened to Telugu flavored Hindi and not had a problem with any of it. But we will eventually make it perfect. And then we will much later start entering oral space so that I can listen to a Malayalam meeting and I'll be getting the translation in my ears.
I want to pick up on this AI thread, but in a minute, because what you said about AI also reminds me that so much of AI is about pattern recognition. Mm-hmm. And pattern recognition is kind of what I feel is like the delightful thread running through your work as well. You are noticing things that other people don't notice. You're picking up patterns that other people don't see. And there's this sense of delight running through your work where you're like noticing these things that other people don't seem to notice. I mean, just to sort of narrow into your own process a little bit, how do you see these things?
See, you all must have noticed that I growled to 3 people on the side and looked at some people here. My brain is wired a little funny, and when the pattern is getting disturbed, I go ballistic. It's a disability, but maybe it's an ability because it allows me to see patterns when I look into them much more clearly, partly because one is willing to think things that are heretical, that every North Indian language has something of a Dravidian substratum. if you can even think that thought, then you can suddenly see paths leading here, there, and the next place. I don't know. I, I keep seeing it, and then when you see things that repeat, like, or repeat in a back sense, that you see Dakini coming into existence, is that how Kannada came into existence, but centuries earlier? If you see things happening in the Caribbean and you see them happening in the Andamans, you begin to make these connections, but you have to be a little heretical. But I find a lot of people are not. They like I am just surprised at how many linguists call the languages of the Magadhan zone, Bengali, Oriya, Assamese, Bihari dialects, Austro-Asiatic. Why? Because you found some old Vietnamese words in them. I mean, it's like blowing my mind. And you cannot get it out of your head that these people could not be mistaken for people from the Mekong Delta. They don't speak with tones. They don't do any Vietnamese things. They just happen to have some words. But how much of linguistics, and not just in India, believes what we're told to believe? Now, when you step off that and say, there was a migration, these are totally Indian languages which have been slightly affected. They started getting Ekta, Duta, Ekjon. They started getting no gender, which is again a very Asian thing. But then you begin to see that there's a continuity in India. And it's a lovely thought, because then you're sitting around with your Google search and you say, let me look at Australian Aboriginal languages. And then you find connectivity with the operating systems of Andaman languages, Karakoram languages, early North Indian languages, and then early tribal languages of the north. There's a whole belt across the north which goes all the way into Ethiopia. And if you're willing to follow it, then you start seeing surprising. Do you know that there are places in Ethiopia where they still have turn, different from turn, Who looked? But this is interesting. You just have to be curious and say, what if? And then it can be there.
Which makes it all the more bizarre that in this extraordinarily diverse geographical territory, there could even exist the idea that we might have something like a national language.
See, in this age of AI, do we need a national language? I mean, you could be getting a feed in your ear in Malayalam while I talk. That's not even far away. If we did decide we needed a national language, but for what? Wouldn't we want our cubby holes where we are still diverse? I think we have, if we look with a different eye, there's no need to get rid of the diversity. It can be handled through the new tech we have. The Chinese had as much diversity as us. They didn't do what we did, which is create many scripts for all our languages. They have a single script which is not non-phonetic. So you can read the same word, like Xian for mountain. The same character in Japanese is Yama. They don't even sound alike, but they're written with the same character. Now, supposing we didn't do this in script like the Chinese, but we did it in an AI layer, where you type in the words in whatever language of India, and they're stored in a virtual form, which can be output that if you say, I want it in Oriya, it knows how it goes into Oriya. It knows that if it's in Hindi, it's got to do twisting around for gender agreements and so on. And I think that we are lucky that we have this option, but we haven't seen how actually similar we are across this landmass. It's not easily visible because it's submerged by vocabulary that is different. But, I mean, anybody who speaks Tamil or Bengali and learns Japanese is shocked at how similar they are. So, and even more similar within India. We've never we never thought about it in that way. We've been so busy thinking of how different we are or how much our words look like European words. We haven't seen deeper, older similarities, which can be used and things can be done.
You are so enthusiastic about AI and the potential for technological mediation. Do you worry about it at all, or do you only see the potential?
I would worry if Indian AI became the wagging tail on the dog of Silicon Valley, because that is AI for the tech bros, for militaristic purposes, for identifying targets for assassination. If that is the kind of thing that AI is being used for, which is justifying that expenditure on their militarism, then you will have a problem with AI. But if we had what I keep saying, our own stack, if we knew we need AI for this, that, and the other, for 80% of the population, which goes and even studies a BA in Malayalam and wonders what to do later, and suddenly you have connectivity with all these people to um make your whole, what you call the Indosphere. There's something exciting in that, but it has to be divorced from Western AI, which is funded by very military objectives. And when they tell you, oh, you know, we don't have to pay them, you don't. You have to use all your water, all your energy to sustain these enormous AI centers. We don't need that much. We can do it much more economically because the level of difficulty is not the same. Like China could do DeepSeek in 2 years because they they were able to use much more efficient computational means. We could do it too. We've been doing it since forever. We've been writing algorithms from the time of Parnini. And I don't know why we haven't understood that, like China, we could do things cheaply. AI in the West has never been concerned about being cheap or efficient. Whenever you tell them, here, you could do this and write this a little differently, they say, what's the point? I can't believe it. We could do so many things much faster, more efficient. 2 years to create a grid, it would be quite easy. One could actually go home right now and start writing, and it would be a pleasure.
My last question before we open it out to the audience. We're in Kerala, and you've touched upon this a little already, but tell us about the Malayalam language in particular. You touch upon it in your first book as well.
Yeah, because that was another opportunity. Besides Dakhini, there was also Kerala, which had in a different way interfaced with migrants coming in, migrants who had power. The Nambudris did not have the kind of military power, but in some kind, but it was a crazy similarity to what happened in Vedic times. You had these men coming in and teaming up with kings, and here you have Nambudris teaming up with Nayars. And I thought that my first interest is, could modern Kerala or Kerala going back to the 12th century give me a view of ancient history in India? Is this how it has always happened? And it was interesting to find that, again, the same thing, males coming in, and a problem about women marrying out, not many women in the. So the similarities that we have seen in India always tempt me to not just look at Kerala and the Indus Valley, but the future. If this has happened again and again and again, that migrants have come, made new languages, created new social formations, what is the future? How different could it be? Because we have a pattern. Because in India, things that have happened in the East, in the Deccan, in the Indus Valley, in Kerala, all over Nepal also, and I'm sure Sri Lanka with Sinhala. It happens again and again. So how different can the future be? And when does the future start? So there are lovely signs that with all the talk of translation, it's starting about now.
So this is a good place for us to close this conversation. We'll move it over to questions from the audience.
Yeah, my question is, with a lot of colonial forces coming in, both the Portuguese, Dutch, French, everybody coming to Kerala, and you having Anglo-Indian, Luso-Indian communities over here at one point, and at the same time you have matriarchal societies which had zero relevance to the father figure, who had no direct interaction with the father figure. So, how would you apply the idea of father tongue or the idea of father tongue or how the language influence, when, especially in the case of Nampudiris, when there is no direct influence, how do you conceptualize it?
How do you understand the father tongue, mother? Well, in a place like Kozhikode, better than anywhere else, I would think, because this is like the other end of the arc, which goes to Zanzibar. Swahili came up, and a kind of Malayalam, which is Arabic influenced, came up here. Again, male migrants, female families, and the idea of a Mappila, that he's a male visitor. So, I mean, again and again, I hadn't even thought of this, but yes, being in Kozhikode is exactly the place to be to say that it's happened again and again. There was a time when they made an attempt to write Malayalam with an adapted Arabic script, but I think that's kind of fallen by the wayside, and it's been assimilated into the mother land and the mother language, and there will be Arabic words again, and you can see it's not Arabic structure, it's Arabic words, and you're finding, however, the notion of grammar is uniform throughout South India, fairly uniform. Yeah? I think that's more exciting than the Portuguese thing. I should know about that because I know Portuguese, but I somehow don't find it as exciting as the Arabic thing that's happened here. And of course, Jewish Malayalam, I remember reading things that they didn't bring in Sanskrit because, so you can get older Malayalam from reading the Jewish Malayalam texts. So you can get layers of changes in the language and time. Christian, I don't think they brought in Syriac words, not really. Okay, I think someone in the back, yeah.
Yeah, I just completed Wanderers, and I've just completed Wanderers, Kings and Merchants, and I'm midway through Father Tongue and Motherland. So I just had a couple of thoughts, questions about. One was, is there a way to detect an Elamite footprint in Indus Valley Civilization language or Vedic Sanskrit? So is there a way to detect the influence of Elamite in IVC because they had trade relations? That's the first question. The second question is from the Persians, from the time Persians came to Indus Valley, from the time when Persians came to Indus Valley in 800, 600 BC to the time of Ghazni in 1000 AD, there has been a constant flow of invaders, migrants from Central Asia. So they would have brought their language, they adapted the culture of the subcontinent. So is there a way to detect their footprint in the languages that came after?
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me break that answer into two. Elamite, I would love to play with that. People have supposed it. Then they have backed off from it. We don't have enough data. That is part of the problem. And the data has come via Mesopotamia, where they have some of the things there. And of course, people saying that Elamite is Elam. I'm not sure. It would be lovely if it was, but we can't, there's so many things that we can almost say, like certain structures I can almost say are there, but the final conclusive proof is not there. And you mentioned about many other streams of people going into the Deccan, right? Indus Valley. We only see if you really look carefully, I don't think it was only Vedic Brahmins who went in from that area. We have people like the Vratyas, other tribes from the Caspian region, which may also have crossed and gone up towards Bengal. We have words in modern languages which refer to non-Vedic, they're Arya but non-Vedic. We have all these people, and there must have been many more. As I said, you can see in modern day Kerala that migration is not just one group, but it matters whether you have power. And if you came with political and military power, then your stamp will remain. It's worth somebody's while to know your language. But in India right now, that we're speaking in English not because the British are here. English really exploded in India only after the British left, because it represented a certain kind of a class, which is to say the elite, which is something that India has done all the time. But if you weren't the British and you just happened to be some foreigner coming in, you have no power. So the power is the link between belief systems, religions, and kings. So again, the Nambudris and the Nayars. That's a very good metaphor. Without that, you don't get a language developing. Yeah.
Hi, ma'am. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Yeah. This is a bit regarding the language X that was in discussion just a moment before. So when I read the Wanderers and Merchants book, I get the feeling that we're talking about the retroflex sounds in Sanskrit being there in Rig Veda, the early Rig Veda, but not being there in other Proto-Indo-European languages such as Greek. So then are we talking about, then how did that arrive, first of all? Like,
How did they arrive?
How did they arrive? And if that had anything to do with the paternal and the maternal differences that we briefly touched. So I wanted to understand, is that the X language that we're talking about, and how did they arrive?
Okay, let me see if I've understood you right. Can you all hear me though? Okay, that retroflex sounds are incredibly old. They are pre-Dravidian. They are in fact going back to the migration out of Africa. Now, remember in the Sanskrit era, they did not write things down. There was memorization. So you had a period where there was a lot of political disunity, a good 700 years, during which these people took the texts, which were most of the mandalas were written, not all of them, and they kept them in different Brahmin families. And 700 years later, the Kuru dynasty said, we're going to use these to get the equivalent of Nayars on board with us. We will use this for Shrauta rituals. So 700 years in the middle had these texts being garbled and used and spoken by people who didn't fully understand Sanskrit. And then the Kuru dynasty sent out people to say, what were they actually saying? By then, normal Sanskrit, not the Rig Veda, but normal spoken Sanskrit, had acquired the na. It never acquired la. But na and sha, which is a very northwestern thing, they were there, but not properly assimilated, only in sandhis. So ta and da were the big ones, and la was not there at all. So by then that was spoken Sanskrit. So they were doing it naturally. It's like if you're speaking if a Malayali had to speak Sanskrit, they would do like a Punjabi. Instead of saying jana, they would say jana. Okay, so this kind of thing was happening. And eventually, young scholars were sent out to collect all the different hymns and create the mandalas, edit them. So in that time, that's 700 years, a certain amount of da and na and sha came in certain circumstances. But if you look at a page, a visual page from the Rig Veda, it will not be as much as you will see in a Malayalam text now. So which tells me also that it's not only that they exist, but in what quantity. And whereas in all the modern, Punjabi is like full of it. It's almost like Marathi. It's not quite like Malayalam. But so these are things that were old, which crept into the language. And by the time Sanskrit was the Rig Veda was made into Samhitas. The language had changed and absorbed some of it, but not as much as the Prakrits did. The Prakrits had much, much more, and much more similar to Malayalam, where the la was there in the Prakrits, but not in Sanskrit.
Hi, ma'am. Yeah. Am I
Yeah.
audible?
Can you come up in front so I can also read your lips? I'm a very old person.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, ma'am. So there's this concept of linguistic relativity, which tells that how the structure of language affects our thought, how we perceive the world. So there are certain in every language there are certain phrases or words that are not present there, but we have that feeling. So, in this modern age, as a digital age is growing, we are consuming a lot of media from different languages. So, we're getting some phrases or words which we didn't have, and once we get it, we feel like home. Yeah, this is it. This is what I felt. Now I got a word. So, do you think this digital media, this entertainment is kind of a new modern way of migration, which is not in a geographical way, but consumed through internet.
Through tech. Yeah.
So, and also, instead of considering, we often say about language barriers. So, instead of language considered as watertight compartments, it's actually uniting people together. And do you also think, because in new days, like new words are being added to the dictionary, even we are not following the standard pronunciation or the modern, even for English, we are not following the modern, the actual standard things. So do you think, one question is, do you think this as a modern way of migration? And also, do you think of a possibility of languages, having less similarity and going to a more standard way, like less of a
Okay.
different?
Let's see if I can put this into a different form. As we have more contact with each other, I'm having contact with you. I can travel here. I can write a book that you might read. You're beginning to find that we are more of a community and our words will spread. But that will not be the grammar. We have a very old relationship which is untouched. That has always been there, the notion of lots of nouns, the notion of how verbs behave, how postpositions behave. We have an old relationship, but a new relationship is getting overlaid, and that is going to be through the socio-political, socio-economic sphere, where because we interact through tech, we will have the same words for computer, we will have a lot of the same words for new things. So, in fact, if you look at Indian languages, you can see many layers, like the bottom layer, the grammar being similar. In between, there's a differentiation because distances grew. Then there's other kingdoms came in, Sanskrit, English, which brought in language words. But this is a top layer. It is not affecting the older relationship. It's just adding to it. So we will get that. And who knows what is going to happen? I think that it's not going to be only borrowed. What about words that have to be coined here? When we become a tech hub like China, which I think we should, where will the words that we coin on our own get added? You know, we have to look a little bit more positively at the future. We don't only borrow, we also create. So that will come at a time when we no longer use English and translate into our languages, but we're generating technology in our own languages. So you'll get a lot of things happening, but the simple way of looking at it is if we are a community, which means we are communicating with each other, we are going to find ways and we're going to find keywords that will match. And we will have an easier time of it. It's not always going to be good. Supposing it means that a decision has to be made, do we sacrifice Tamil for Kannada? I mean, these things may happen. Where are the tech hubs located? I think that's what will decide it. if the tech hubs are not not located in Jharkhand, you're not going to see those dialects coming up. But so I think it's all going to hinge in the future on tech and which languages Sorry, I've just got on excited because AI is exciting to me.
So in the interest of time, we'll have to wrap up this discussion. Thank you everyone for being a patient listener, and thanks also to Peggy Mohan for sharing her perspectives on how ideas and especially the languages cross-pollinate. Thank you very much once again on behalf of Kerala Literature Festival.